Hey, this is Trey. U.S. immigration policies have been in the spotlight recently. There are reports on conditions of some of the southern border camps, concerns about children being held apart from their parents, and some people are divided about what to call these facilities.
The United States is running concentration camps on our southern border, and that is exactly what they are. They are concentration camps.
That's the U.S. Congresswoman from New York, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
If that doesn't bother you, we can have, okay, whatever. I want to talk to the people that are concerned enough with humanity to say that we should not, that never again means something.
You're listening to Us and Them, the podcast where we look at things that divide Americans. And immigration is certainly one of those topics that drive us apart. Reaction and responses to the Congresswoman's concentration camp comments have been quick to condemn.
I think Congresswoman AOC needs to apologize, not only to the nation, but to the world.
This type of rhetoric from our elected leaders is irresponsible, reckless, misinformed, and wrong.
We've had a long history, if you go back, at people who really are left-wing zealots, ignoring history, ignoring facts to pursue their causes. At some point, you just sort of run out of ways to describe how ignorant this is.
To be clear, the U.S. government holds immigrants who have entered the country illegally while they're being processed. The question is, what do we call these places? Are they detention centers, as the U.S. government refers to them? Are they detainment camps? Is Ocasio-Cortez misinformed, or perhaps hyperbolic when she injects a loaded term like concentration camp into the discussion? A while ago, we talked with author Andrea Pitzer about her book, One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. She has carefully studied the history of such camps, and we thought in light of the new discussions, it might be a good time to check back in with her. Hey, Andrea, when we talked back in the winter of 2018, we ended our conversation about the history of concentration camps with how it was that we would classify the detention camp at Guantanamo Bay. But since that conversation, lots has changed, and there's a renewed attention on how the U.S. is detaining refugees and immigrants on the southern border. And we hear a lot about people being kept in deplorable conditions without adequate food and health care, and of course, children being separated from their parents. How would you define the U.S. detention centers at the border now?
I would classify them as concentration camps. When we spoke, they were still sitting, so that was about a year and a half ago, they were still sitting in a little bit of a gray area for me. The last several administrations have run detention centers in ways that have been pretty punitive, and courts have had to intervene, and there have been a lot of problems for a really long time. But what we've seen with the Trump administration starting in a little over a year ago is really putting the detention camp side of things at the heart of this policy of dealing with migrants and refugees and asylum seekers. And that's really kind of pitched it over the edge into a more classical model of concentration camp.
Well, New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez got a lot of flack for using the term concentration camp to describe these detention centers. Does it really matter what we call them?
Well, a lot of people have asked me about her comments, and I can't speak to her intent or what knowledge she had when she made it. It is an accurate way to describe it because there's 40 years of history before we get to places like Auschwitz and the death camps of things called concentration camps. And that history, particularly the first decade or so, where there were a lot of camps with women and children where people weren't being gassed, they weren't being exterminated actively in a violent way, but they were put in overcrowded conditions. They weren't necessarily given enough food. They may not have had medical treatment. And, a lot of people died, tens of thousands of people in some camp systems, more than 100,000 in another one. It's a really lethal setup, and it's not that different than what we're doing. I think the thing we have to be clear about is that the death camp system of the Holocaust put in in the mid-40s, in the early 40s going to the end of the war, that's a very different system. That was set up separately from the Nazi concentration camp system, and on top of it, about a decade into when they had first started using camps. So I do want to be clear, there's nothing else in history like those camps, but there's a long history of concentration camps.
Well, are camps today under a different scrutiny than they would have been at the early part of the last century? Then, because people around the world are watching them in real time, we see things being reported, through social media and certainly, in the mainstream news media. And we see that. We see people who are going into the camps are shooting some video or getting some audio on their cell phones. We kind of know what's going on. Does that make a difference?
Well, I think there's two things. First of all, we don't really know what's going on. I mean, certainly we get some important glimpses, some valuable glimpses, and certainly the world is watching. But you know what? The world was watching more than 100 years ago, too. American newspapers carried stories of these Cuban camps. British newspapers, after this radical named Emily Hobhouse went down into those British-run camps in southern Africa, she came back with stories as well. And it was those insights that really helped to make a difference. But one thing I'll say is I don't know that it's gotten better because the Cuban camps more than 100 years ago, Americans were so worried about people dying in them that we were shipping condensed milk, beans, medical supplies. Americans were gathering and donating and sending that stuff to the people who were detained in the camps, and they were accepting all that. The Spanish allowed that stuff in. I heard just this week that people tried to take soap and toothpaste and toothbrushes and base and shoes and socks and drop them off at some of these border facilities, and it was all rejected. They weren't taken. So I'm not sure that we're as far ahead of 100-plus years ago as we think we are.
Well, when we think of the historical World War II version of the concentration camps, and they were designed to hold citizens that their government thought of as suspicious or dangerous. In the southern border camps of today, refugees and immigrants are not U.S. citizens, but the U.S. detains them nonetheless. I'm just wanting to check with you. Is there historical precedent for what we're doing?
Well, there are at least a couple in important ways. One, let's go back to World War II, the exact sort of window that you're thinking of, the classical camps, but not necessarily the place you're thinking of. In France, in the 1930s, just to the south in Spain, there was a civil war. And the people who were fighting the fascist General Franco were losing the battle. There was a point late in the 30s where they were basically defeated, and they came across the border, hundreds of thousands of them fleeing, what they thought would be death in a period of weeks. So just this vast influx that France was not at all prepared for. So refugees, leaving a terribly dangerous situation, seeking asylum. They were almost all radical leftists. France was very polarized and decided they didn't want them infiltrating, and that's not sort of my word, that's their word, the southern cities. So they set up these camps, and they set them up in the middle of nowhere, really poorly sited, with no real plan on how food was going to be brought there. So they weren't necessarily trying to kill the people that were coming over, but they clearly wanted them to be uncomfortable.
When I talked with Andrea Pitzer about a year and a half ago, she explained that the practice of concentration camps began in Cuba.
The very first camps, the very first time you have this phrase, it was in Spanish originally, reconcentración, which in English is very quickly translated as concentration camps. It arises in the 1890s in Cuba under the Spanish Empire.
In 1896, General Valeriano Weyler was sent by the Spanish Empire to thwart a rebellion of insurgents who'd been fighting against Spanish rule for decades. As governor of Cuba, General Weyler set up the reconcentración system.
The governor general there decides that the only way to defeat these people is to basically shoot everybody that you think is an insurgent, and in order to find those people, to sweep all the peasants out of the countryside and put them behind barbed wire in loyalist towns. So they were in with the general population, but they were on the outskirts and they were living in horrific conditions. So it's not quite the segregated camps we think of where you really isolate people today, but they were sort of internally isolated. Their crops were burned, their homes were taken, they had nothing, they had no way to make a living, and they had no food. So they starved to death. And so there's this moment in history where these camps emerge, and it's on Cuba.
From history class, I remember that it was the sinking of the battleship USS Maine that drew us into that war.
Everyone thinks of the sinking of the Maine as the trigger that brings us into the war, and it is the trigger. But the reason the U.S. is ready to go to war is because they have been hearing horrific newspaper reports and accounts of what's going on in these camps, and that people are starving and dying literally in the streets. And Spain is really cast as a pretty horrific villain. And so the U.S. is already all ginned up against what Spain is doing.
But consider this. Cuba's General Weyler, who established the concentration camp system, claimed to be copying the battle tactics of American Civil War generals, specifically William Tecumseh Sherman's devastating March to the Sea, which broke the back of the Confederacy and led to its eventual surrender.
You see the general, who's nicknamed the Butcher, who prosecutes that war and launches the first camps, literally saying there is no difference in what the U.S. did in that war and what I am doing now.
Pitzer says Weyler's strategy was an evolution of the scorched earth campaign that Generals Sherman and Sheridan used to eviscerate Confederate states, which left civilians starving, homeless, or dead.
There was this idea, leave them nothing but their eyes to weep with, to literally burn the crops, burn the homes, to affect and afflict the civilian population so that they themselves would not want their fighters, their insurgents, to continue. I think the Civil War is this moment of total war where we decide that, in this case, for a really good cause, an end to slavery, this would be the moment to insist on total victory, complete surrender from your enemy, that you get to dictate the terms. And yet, the things that we excused in that war, in the pursuit of this really noble thing, were picked up and used in later conflicts.
U.S. Senator John Sherman, the younger brother of General Sherman, didn't see that General Weyler's concentration camps were on the same moral plane as the Civil War. And he was outraged by General Weyler's treatment of more than 300,000 Cuban citizens. Senator Sherman wrote that Weyler's hands are forever stained with the blood of defenseless women and children. Congress voted to go to war against Spain on April 25, 1898.
We land in 1898 at the start of that war at Guantanamo Bay. That's the point we go in through, and we never leave.
America emerged victorious from the 10-week Spanish-American War, and as a result, we ended up occupying Cuba and the Philippines. President William McKinley and his administration now face the weighty challenges of managing the Philippines, located on the far side of the globe. To tamp down a popular revolt, they took a page from the Spanish playbook and set up concentration camps. The camps were filthy, littered with disease and death, conditions which one U.S. soldier likened to a suburb of hell. The detainees were tortured, and because this was not on American soil, they were denied any legal processes. And as we will learn, these features would reemerge almost exactly 100 years later, again at the hands of Americans during a crisis. The first decade of concentration camps unfolded at the dawn of two technologies that helped make them more lethal over time: the mass production of barbed wire and automatic weapons.
Both of those things combine to allow you to hold a large group of people with a very small guard force in a way it wasn't possible before. So there's this moment of technology that is kind of a tipping point that allows camps to happen.
In the early 20th century, both Germany and Britain ran concentration camps in southern Africa. As the First World War progressed, the sun never set on concentration camps, as the practice expanded throughout the vast British Empire. Eventually, Stalinist Russia would adopt the practice and place their own countrymen in gulags. Of course, the most infamous camp system was deployed by the Nazis during the Second World War. Whereas the Nazis established their camps over time, the Japanese internment camps in America seemed like a swift reflexive response to the attack on Pearl Harbor.
We interned Japanese Americans, not just enemy aliens, but, Japanese Americans who were American civilians. Some 70,000 were interned in the U.S. It's like locking you or me up. Those people should have had the same rights. But because of the Pearl Harbor bombing, camps become the response of that.
I'd always thought that the Roosevelt administration had rounded up Japanese Americans and placed them into camps out of a knee-jerk sense of panic after Pearl Harbor. Pitzer says this wasn't the case. She says there was an intelligence officer who'd been keeping tabs on a Japanese spy ring. He claimed to have busted the group a few months before Pearl Harbor and had identified almost all the people that were of concern.
He had lived in Japan for a time. He was very tied into the community on the West Coast, and he wrote a report saying that most of the people who were dangerous were known and belonged to organizations that were understood to be cooperating with Japanese government. It would be against American interests and also unfair to intern everybody. He wrote a report that was handed to the highest levels in the military circles at the time. The Attorney General was on his side. J. Edgar Hoover was on his side. Eleanor Roosevelt was very much on their side, and for a time, Franklin Roosevelt was. But the pressure of politicians and people who wanted to make something out of this, create the us and them, they were able to pressure the general who was in charge of this zone, and he ended up being neutral at first and then moving to a position where he said, after all, a Jap is a Jap. So it was not an inevitable moment of panic that did it. It was a concerted effort by some people to sway the general, who would then have the leverage to assert military control, which in times of crisis, we tend to want the military to deal with those situations so that they aren't tied with a lot of bureaucracy and they aren't slowed down.
Reading Pitzer's book, I find myself getting chills thinking about being on the wrong side of an us and them struggle, where my kind is considered a them by an us majority, and that they've concluded that the best solution for society would be to have my kind rounded up and removed. Basically saying we are us and they are them.
Right, but the way you do that is you try to pick out whatever, because of course we all have communities and we all have identifying characteristics. So you start to pick those characteristics as the ones that are a problem. That art is decadent. Those ideas are not German. Hitler, he embraced this idea of animal rights and being against cruelty to animals. So Jews were portrayed, because of their kosher practices and slaughtering, as perverted and cruel and tormentors of animals and sadistic. And so any difference will suffice if you lean on it hard enough. But it takes time.
Pitzer's book is chock full of historical examples of both the slow and quick way camps come into being, like the Japanese internment, when the call and justification for opening camps was accompanied by the paranoid mantra of extreme times call for extreme measures. Another good example would be after World War I, when Britain reviewed the effectiveness of their camp system.
The British did end up doing universal internment. And then after the war, they assessed it and they said, that was really unproductive. It didn't prevent any, the big fear was espionage. It didn't prevent any of that. We broke up a lot of communities. It ruined a lot of people's lives. It took a lot of money and a lot of guards when we needed them doing other things. And so if this happens again, we're not going to do it a second time.
But then World War II breaks out and there's fear of invasion. And the same rhetoric of extreme times calling for extreme measures leads the Brits to intern Germans living in England.
What was interesting this second time was that many of the Germans who were in the country at that moment were German Jews who had managed to get out of Germany. So they ended up locking up Nazi sympathizers in the same camps with German Jews who had fled. And the optics of this were so obviously nuts that as people who were, activists or journalists started calling attention to this, that this was a terrible response and this was a cowardly response, Britain was sort of shamed out of it, and they began releasing many of these prisoners, but not before they had deported thousands of them to Canada and Australia and, still changing these people's lives. Now, it's important to say this was not Auschwitz. The danger of looking at all these camps as a whole is that you make everything the same. What Britain did in the war, what we did in the war was very different than the level of what the Nazis were doing or even Soviet camps. But in that case, Britain knew it was against their ideals. And they did it, again, because this argument about extreme times is followed. And what I found with the book is that it usually causes many more problems than it solves. It isn't just like, we'll violate their rights for a time, but this is what we need to do. It actually often makes the problem worse.
Author and journalist Andrea Pitzer. After a short break, she'll take us back to where the story of concentration camps began, Cuba. And she'll tell us why she's included the U.S. Detention Center at Guantanamo in her history of concentration camps.
For a long period of time, we aren't even public about what we call them or anything because we're so careful to give them no rights.
I'm Trey Kay, and this is Us and Them from PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting. Us and Them is supported in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council, the CRC Foundation, and the Daywood Foundation.
Music lifts us up and brings us together, even when we can't get together in person. Mountain Stage brings you live performances on the air, online, and in our podcast. They remind you how it feels to be in a live audience listening to live music. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find a link to our stations and our podcast online at mountainstage.org.
You're listening to Us and Them. I'm Trey Kay. And we're talking about immigration today and the term concentration camp, which evokes a particular era. World War II, the Holocaust, striped uniforms, yellow stars of David, forced labor, starving, gas chambers. And all of this happened somewhere else, over there. After 9/11, we opened a detention camp at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, to deal with unlawful enemy combatants, those people we were hunting in the war on terror. In theory, Gitmo was a prisoner of war camp. Andrea Pitzer has studied the history of such camps for her book, One Long Night, A Global History of Concentration Camps. And in reality, she says Guantanamo has become a concentration camp on steroids.
What I originally started out thinking was that I would see how it did and didn't fit into that tradition, because I thought perhaps it was sort of a 21st century new version of what we would do.
Since the world has advanced in know-how and technology, Pitzer thought we'd create a camp that would be significantly different from previous wars and times.
And what I found is it actually neatly fit into the evolution of these kinds of camps at the end of the 20th century. So while it is sort of the 21st century face of what I think is next, I think it's also not as distinct as I originally thought it was.
After 9/11, America was in wounded tiger mode.
I can hear you, the rest of the world hears you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
President George W. Bush's approval rating shot up 35 points in the days after 9/11. And it was clear that he was appealing to a great number of Americans who wanted vengeance. Looking back at that time, when the president stood on the rubble of the fallen Twin Towers and addressed first responders through a bullhorn, it was clear that this was one of those big events that Andrea Pitzer was referring to. This was a time like the sinking of the Lusitania passenger ship or the bombing of Pearl Harbor. This was a time when emotions were at a fevered pitch, and things were moving very quickly.
I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice.
There's an old poster out west, as I recall, that said, "Wanted, dead or alive. Terrorists who once occupied Afghanistan now occupy cells at Guantanamo Bay."
The U.S. leads a coalition invasion into Afghanistan and starts rounding up suspects the government believes might have had something to do with the attacks on September 11th, or may have knowledge of additional imminent attacks. These suspects eventually get shipped to Cuba.
In terms of the people who are brought there, even Bush-era people who worked on this later say there was not a vetting process that should have happened. So not only did we not observe the laws of war, we didn't even really vet people before they went.
Cuba is where the first so-called concentration camps took root. But such detainment or detention centers have become sadly common. Over time, the use of them has adjusted according to the needs of the moment and the changing challenges of human migration. Why do you think the historical obligations for asylum seekers has changed so dramatically?
We are in the midst of a very cruel era, I think. Post 9/11, I don't think 9/11 definitively caused it, but I think that there was an idea that national security, or not even real national security, but this idea of national security somehow required us to turn our backs on everybody and just turn into ourselves. But we see it around the globe right now with far-right leaders that, are building extra high barbed wire, this impulse of Brexit to leave the EU, which is not camps related at all. I don't want to suggest that, but just this idea of turning away from any kind of international community. And certainly you can make a political case for either side of that. But what we've been seeing play out is some very cruel versions of it.
Well, you've studied in great detail the stories of concentration camps throughout history. And I think that for each story that I read in your book, there seems to be kind of a narrative arc to each camp. And I guess my question to you would be, can you say where we are in the story arc of today's southern border detention centers?
Unfortunately, I think we are fairly early in on that story arc, and the fact that we have such bad conditions at this point in time and a government that seems unconcerned about, in terms of the administration, unconcerned about doing anything about it, I think conditions could get quite a bit worse. Historically, what happens is things come from the periphery, and then they come into the center of power. You start with one group that's detained, and it becomes other groups that get detained. It starts to hearken to the deliberate strategy that camps were put to in police states, which was terror. Camps were a tool of terror. And I think this administration wants to strike terror in the migrant community, but I don't think it's just for people who are, as they say, crossing the border illegally, which is really generally people seeking asylum in perfectly legal ways. And I think the idea that this is somehow just going to stop with people who are crossing the border is a naive idea given concentration camp history.
Well, when you say that about we're kind of at the beginning of the arc, I keep coming back to something that you said to me in our first interview, and that you said that a lot of work has to be done, that us and them divide is so deep that people are willing to harm other human beings. And I guess my question to you is, what kind of dividing work has been done for our nation to countenance these detention centers?
Well, we have 100 years of punitive immigration policy that has shown immigrants in the absolute worst light that they could sort of falsely be portrayed in, despite the fact that they are a net plus in the country in terms of taxes, in terms of, over time, it all adds to the country that they're less violent than the U.S.-born population overall, probably because they want to be sure they don't get deported. I think post 9/11, the idea of the dangerous foreigner, the dark-skinned foreigner, the destabilizing person sneaking across the border, really took on a life and virulence that the current administration has pushed into. So there's been a lot of work to prepare that ground. But at the same time, I think that if it requires all that work, as it does to train people to do this, you can also untrain them by humanizing these people and their plight, by underlining the real facts about the situation, and just by refusing to countenance ill treatment. Just like saying, we're America, we should not be abusing, these vulnerable people. We shouldn't be abusing anybody.
Andrea, I am so grateful that you were willing to speak with us again today. This is a really important topic, and I'm just really grateful that you're continuing to share your knowledge with us. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on.
You've been listening to Us and Them. Our team for this show is me, Trey Kay, Loretta Williams, Lori Stern, Mitch Hanley, and Kate Smith. Special thanks to the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Michael Lipton and Tristam Lozow wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Additional music in this episode by Blue Dot Sessions. Mark Lerner designed our logo. The wonderful people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the West Virginia Humanities Council, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the CRC Foundation, and the Daywood Foundation. Hey, if you'd like to hear a longer version of my recent interview with Andrea Pitzer, we've posted it as a bonus download. And you can grab it anywhere where you get your podcast, or you can go to the West Virginia Public Broadcasting website, wvpublic.org, and hear it there. We'll see you next time on Us and Them.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
From PRX.